8-year-old black boy defends his mom on a plane, stuns everyone with his legal genius, and silences the entire cabin with one unexpected act. The air in the business class cabin was thick with a kind of simmering tension. The passengers sat still, their eyes fixed on the skinny boy standing upright in the middle of the aisle, like a magnetic needle in a magnetic silence. Elijah Brooks, 8 years old, round glasses, gray sweater, and planet print backpack, stood steady, his chin slightly raised, his bright eyes flashing with a calm yet strangely precise gaze. The flight attendant who had yelled at his mother a few minutes earlier stood across from him, her usual confident expression gone. In her hands was the ventilator belonging to an elderly passenger named Claire Hayes, who had just been denied access to it for failure to declare it. And now a child was protesting. Under the Airline Access Act of 1986, specifically Title 14, Code of Federal Regulations Section 382.133, any passenger with a medical device has the right to use that device if it does not interfere with the safety of flight, Elijah said, his voice calm and clear. A refusal that is not based on a specific medical assessment or risk is a violation of federal law. A wave of surprise swept through the cabin like a cold wind. The middle-aged man reading in seat 2C slowly lowered his window. The female student in the back seat stopped typing on her laptop. Even the crying baby suddenly fell silent, as if caught up in the rhythm of the changing space. "Kid, what do you think you're doing?" The flight attendant lowered her voice. "I'm exercising my right," Elijah replied, pulling a neatly clipped folder from a pocket in his backpack. "I have a printout of the FAA regulations and the most recent update from the DOT. If you want, I can give you a copy, or we can have the flight supervisor help explain it." There was a long silence. The woman named Claire was in tears. A clap broke out, then spread, soft, quiet, but clear. The whole compartment seemed to be awakened, not by a law, but by the courage of a child. Who was this boy? How did an 8-year-old know more about airline terminology than a seasoned flight attendant? And what led to this impossible moment, mid-air, at 30,000 feet? To understand that, we have to go back 48 hours, where it all really began. 2 hours before a Boeing 787 took off from O'Hare Airport, Mia Brooks's inbox rang with a dry ding. In the quiet of the night, in her small apartment in the Chicago suburbs, she sat motionless in front of the cold, bright screen of her old laptop. The subject line contained just 4 words, "About Mom." The sender was Mia's younger sister, Zoe Brooks, who had left Chicago 3 years earlier and had barely been in touch since her sister's tumultuous divorce. Inside the email was a short but heavy message. "The doctor says Mom doesn't have much time left. Terminal pancreatic cancer. If you want to see her one last time, I've booked round-trip tickets for you and your daughter, landing in SFO Friday night." Mia read it over and over again. Her hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the memory. 3 years without a phone call. 3 years since her mother Grace had walked away without a word after Mia's divorce from Andre. She had called the breakdown of their marriage unforgivable weakness. And Mia, exhausted from being a single mother, didn't have the courage to face her mother. The only sound in the room was the rustling of papers. Eli, a skinny, black 8-year-old boy with round-rimmed glasses, was sitting in a corner armchair reading The Giving Tree. Without asking, Mia knew he had finished reading the email. He always read faster than his mother, and somehow, always understood better. "The tree gave everything it had, you know," Eli said, his voice as light as a thread tied around his heart. "In the end, all that was left was the stump. But the boy came back. Because that was home." Mia closed her eyes. Not because of the story, but because of the way her son spoke. Calm, thoughtful, as if he were not just 8 years old, but had lived many lifetimes. "Do you think she wants to see you?" Mia asked, her voice hoarse as if emerging from a layer of dusty memories. Eli didn't answer right away. He put down the book, stepped closer, and gently placed his hand on her shoulder. "She may not have said it, but the important thing isn't whether she wanted to." He looked her straight in the eyes, so deep that Mia saw herself reflected in them. "It's whether you could live with not coming, if she died without you saying anything." There was a long silence. "I replied to Aunt Zoe's email," Eli continued, almost in a whisper. "I just wrote one line, 'My mom is going.' And I'm going with her. He raised his head, smiling softly. I think Grandma needs to see Mom one last time, but I think Mom needs to see Grandma too, so she doesn't carry that hole in her heart forever. Mia lowered her head and hugged Eli tightly. In his small arms, she was no longer the struggling mother, no longer the woman who had failed in her marriage and had her mother turn her back on her. She was just a child. Of a mother she had loved until she was heartbroken, then angry until she ran out of tears. Zoe had it all covered. 2 round-trip tickets, economy class, flight leaving in less than 2 days. Eli chose, not with words but with his eyes, with the way he stood by his mother, not retreating. The clock reads 11:47 p.m. Mia stood up, quietly pulled the old silver suitcase from under the sink, wiped the light dust off the handle. Nothing needed to be said. No one needed to say anything. For the most important things, Eli said it. Briefly, precisely, fully. The way an 8-year-old, black, bespectacled child, but with a heart big enough to understand what adults dare not face, chose to love his mother through action. The next morning, the alarm went off at 6:15, but Mia was already awake. She sat in the empty kitchen, her hands wrapped around a warm ceramic mug. Outside, the Chicago sky was a leaden gray, and light snow fell on the windowsill. The apartment was so quiet that the sound of flipping through a book in the living room was barely a whisper. Mia turned around. Eli was sitting in the middle of the floor, surrounded by a series of clear plastic boxes, meticulously compartmentalized. Asthma medication, medical records, notebooks, a document carefully titled, Contingency Plans. Mom. The 8-year-old boy, wearing round-rimmed glasses, flipped through each page with absolute concentration, like a medical resident preparing for his first surgery. Mia started to speak, but stopped. Because in the early morning light, something stopped her. The way Eli checked his spare inhaler, folded his prescriptions neatly, labeled each compartment in his backpack. Nothing was superfluous. Nothing was childish. This is not a boy preparing for a trip. This is a child preparing so that his mother will not fall. They left home earlier than usual. Mia said it was to avoid traffic, but really, it was to avoid silence. All the way to the airport, Eli didn't ask any questions or show any signs of worry. He just looked out the train window, his eyes scanning each stop as if he was memorizing the route. His hand lightly squeezed the strap of his black backpack, which was filled with things no one taught a child to carry. At the TSA checkpoint, as the security guard flipped through their medicine bags suspiciously, Mia was about to explain when Eli stepped forward. We carry albuterol inhaler and prednisolone prophylactically. Have prescription from Dr. Mitchell with ADA endorsement, printed 2 copies. The employee was stunned for a moment. Then he silently nodded and let it pass. Before Mia could react, Eli turned away, as if it was just a small matter among the many things he had to worry about today. As the two of them reached the waiting room near the departure gate, the airport loudspeaker announced, Flight 2317 to San Francisco will be delayed 25 minutes due to final technical checks. Some passengers sighed, others started making phone calls. Mia touched her son's arm lightly. Let's sit over there. They chose a row near the back. Across from them sat an older couple, a silver-haired woman in a woolen shawl, a tall, thin man folding a copy of the Wall Street Journal. They spoke quietly, close enough for Eli to hear. I told you, the old woman whispered. The plane was searched twice today. I'm worried. You read too much in the newspapers again, the husband replied. The 787 is the safest plane. Eli tilted his head. At first he hesitated, but then, as if prompted by something, he stepped forward and spoke softly. Sorry to interrupt, but I read the FAA data on the Boeing 787. You're right about the accident rate, about 17 times lower than being struck by lightning. But if you're looking at the mechanical delay rate alone, you might want to look at the update from last week. Both adults froze. Ellen, the silver-haired woman, looked at Mia and chuckled. John folded the newspaper and nodded. What's your name? Eli. And I don't really like flying, but I like knowing the safest way to fly. Just like that, and the atmosphere lightened. Mia moved closer, just as Ellen took her hand. You're so lucky. This kid not only knows, but is very empathetic. Mia squeezed her hand and nodded. A lump rose in her throat, not from the compliment, but from the realization. Eli hadn't needed anyone to teach him how to heal for years. He'd learned it on his own, just to protect his mother. Before boarding the plane, Eli handed his mother a thin folder, a medication log, indicators in case Grace got sick, and a yellow sticky note taped to the top. Try the 4-7-8 breathing technique if you feel anxious. Soft, deep, slow. I'll sit next to you. Mia held the paper. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not because of fear, but because there was so much she wanted to say, but couldn't express. When the loudspeaker called the first group of passengers, Eli squeezed his mother's hand. He said nothing, nor did he need to. He stepped through the jetway as if he were carrying not just his luggage, but his mother's heart, carefully wrapped and protected to the very end. Flight 2317 took off from O'Hare at 8:06 p.m., nearly 40 minutes late, but no one in business class paid any attention to the time. They were tired, they wanted peace, and most of all, they didn't want anything to interrupt the quiet, polite suspension between Chicago and San Francisco. Mia sat in seat 4B, right next to the bulkhead with the economy cabin. Eli sat next to her, his black backpack neatly at his feet, his headphones hanging loosely around his neck. But his eyes never left the row in front of him, where an older woman, light brown skin and tired appearance, was fumbling with her bag under the seat. She was Claire Hayes. Her name had been given to her by the flight attendant as she checked her ticket. Her silver hair was tied back, her cheekbones were sunken, and there was something in her eyes that made Eli glance over every now and then, as if he were trying to read an equation from them. A complicated equation, perhaps one of endurance. It all started when Claire pulled out a small gray device about the length of her hand, a portable ventilator, the kind used to help people with chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. As she bent down to attach the tube, a flight attendant approached. Tall, with neatly combed hair, her face not angry but completely expressionless. "Ma'am, this device was not previously reported. The aircraft cannot guarantee the safety of unregistered devices according to TSA guidelines and airline regulations. Please put it back." Claire looked up. "This is the Inogen G5, an FAA-certified model. I've flown it 3 times this year without a problem." The flight attendant kept her voice even, but each word began to take on a nuance of emphasis. "We understand your special needs. However, for unregistered equipment, airline regulations allow for refusal of use in the cabin. If you have difficulty, you can sound the alarm, and we will provide emergency medical assistance after takeoff." Claire paled. She clenched her hands around the device as if letting go would drain the air from her lungs. But the surprise did not come from the woman. It came from behind her, from where a young voice spoke, not high, not loud, but strangely sharp and calm. "I'm sorry, but denying FAA-approved medical equipment is a violation of Section 382.133 of the Air Carrier Access Act, 14 CFR Part 3A2, promulgated by the United States Department of Transportation." The whole cabin stopped. Eli stood. He took off his glasses, pulled a slim file from his backpack, and opened it to the first page. There was no panic in his words, just careful decisiveness, as if he had practiced this 100 times, not to win, but to win back his humanity. By law, airlines are required to allow the use of a qualified portable medical device if the passenger demonstrates compatibility, regardless of whether they have declared it in advance. In this case, Ms. Hayes had the right to use the Inogen G5. Refusing the device is not only discriminatory, but can also be recorded and prosecuted by the FAA. A few passengers began to take notice. A few craned their necks over the seats in front of them. Others whispered. A man with a Cartier watch and graying hair put down a law journal on a folding table and stood up. "I'm Mark Reed, civil rights attorney, New York State Bar. The boy is absolutely right." He stepped toward Claire, his voice clear and resonant. "If you continue to refuse, I will be forced to file a complaint, and I will assist Ms. Hayes in filing a complaint with the Department of Transportation." No one said anything more. Claire, who had been bowing her head, now put her hand to her mouth, as if to hold back something deeper than tears. She installed the device. The engine started up softly, so soft that it wouldn't bother anyone, but loud enough to remind the entire cabin that sometimes just a well-timed breath can mean life. A row of seats behind me clapped. Then a few more, not loud but steady like small waves lapping the shore, a quiet, unobtrusive recognition. Eli didn't smile. He sat down, folded the file, and tucked it carefully into his pocket. Mia put her hand gently on his shoulder. She didn't speak, but there was something shaky and steady about the grip, like she didn't know who was protecting whom anymore. In that moment, the tension between a system and a person was broken. Not by power, but by understanding. Not by anger, but by righteousness. The flight touched down on the SFO runway at 11:42 p.m. The western sky was no longer a sunset, but a scattering of flickering lights, like unfinished thoughts. The stream of business-class passengers quietly disembarked, dragging with them the heavy darkness of untold stories. Just beyond the glass doors of the arrivals area stood Zoe, in an olive-colored sweater, holding a steaming mug of ginger tea. She carried no flowers or name tag, just red eyes and a gray agate necklace, a birthday present from Mia years ago. When she saw her sister and Eli come out, Zoe didn't immediately walk over, but stood still for a few seconds, as if testing whether the 3-year gap could be bridged in a heartbeat. Then she walked quickly towards them, and without a word, the two women embraced. Not passionately, not crying. But in that embrace there was a slight trembling from the chest, a tear falling into each other's hair, and a very small smile, as if the past, though full of sharp edges, knew how to be moved when witnessing the moment when two broken pieces quietly found their original form. Eli stood by, not interrupting. He just gently took off his backpack, handed Zoe a bottle of water, and whispered, "You need to hydrate." Zoe laughed through her tears, nodded, and wiped her eyes with her sleeve. They didn't go to the hospital that night. Zoe drove them to the small house in the Richmond district, the house Grace had lived in since her divorce, filled with warm lights and the smell of dried jasmine. She was sitting in an armchair by the window, a blanket draped over her waist, the book in her hand long closed. The sound of the door opening made her tilt her head slightly, her bleary eyes blinking a few times as if she couldn't believe what she saw. It wasn't Mia who walked in first. It was Eli. He walked slowly, like a careful postman delivering a fragile gift. In his hand were 3 printed sheets of paper, paragraphs he had written himself, explaining the concept of quantum entanglement in everyday language, and interspersing them with a short story about the invisible thread that binds people who have been separated. "I thought you would like this better than flowers," Eli said as he stood in front of Grace, his eyes just a fraction higher than where she sat. Grace took it, read the first line, then looked up. The light from the desk lamp fell on her wrinkled cheeks, where tears had just fallen, and then blossomed into a smile. "This boy, is he the one who restructured your universe?" she said, half joking, and her voice, though hoarse and weak, still retained the old humor that had made the family laugh every Christmas Eve. Mia came last, standing still for a moment. Grace's eyes lingered on her, as if she were tracing an old map, trying to read roads never taken. Neither of them said anything right away. There was no need. Because the soft breathing between them, again, as if it had been so long ago, spoke enough to say everything left behind between the times they hadn't seen each other. That night, in the warm little house, there were no excuses, no tragedies, no lessons that ended with heavy philosophy. There was only a boy with round glasses, reading aloud a passage about quantum mechanics, and a silver-haired woman laughing, holding her grandson's hand for a long time, as if for the first time in many years she could breathe a full breath, not because of the machine, but because her heart was lighter. And in that breath, each piece of the past seemed to shift slightly, not exactly gone, but becoming less heavy. As if Eli, in a logical yet emotional language, had unintentionally rewritten the equation of a family, not with a pen but with presence. When the clock struck 8:07 p.m., Dr. Patel appeared in the doorway, still in his crisp white lab coat, but his eyes behind his thin glasses no longer held the pure objectivity of a medical professional. The doctor didn't need to say much. A nod, a sigh, an announcement in a low, slow voice. "She may not make it through the night. Her heart rate is weakening. I suggest the family stay by her side." Then he gently placed his hand on Mia's shoulder, as if it were a gesture that was just reassuring, but also enough to say that from now on, the doctor was just a bystander. The room was dimly lit. The scent of lavender wafted through the air from the diffuser. Grace lay quietly in the hospital bed by the window, her silver hair spread out on the pillow, her face gaunt but calm. Zoe sat on her left, holding her mother's hand. Mia sat on her right, not touching, just watching. Eli stood at the foot of the bed, his hands behind his back like a student about to give a presentation. Only this time, what he brought wasn't to prove, but to touch. "Are you scared?" Eli asked, gently, as if not wanting to disturb Grace's fragile breathing. She opened her eyes slowly, looking at him. It took a few seconds for the image in front of her to clear, then she shook her head slightly. "Don't be afraid, Eli. It's just, I regret the afternoons I didn't get to ask your mother, are you okay today? I regret the years I forgot how to love with silence." Eli nodded, then took a stack of papers from his backpack. The passages he had prepared, pages about the idea of time in curved space, but written like a fairy tale. He read, his voice not loud, not soft, enough to spread throughout the room like the whisper of a star in the dark night. Outside the window, the streetlights flickered on the glass, as if the universe was listening too. Every passage Eli reads is an image. There is a string stretching from a dead star to the heart of the person left behind. There are time holes where one can send a belated apology, and there is a space called family, where if we return, everything is still waiting for us, even though somehow time has pushed everyone too far away. Grace said nothing more, just smiled faintly. Her breathing was ragged, but her eyes were still bright, like someone who had found a place to go, with nothing to hold them back. Zoe's grip tightened. Mia bowed her head slightly, touching the back of her mother's hand to her forehead. Eli, on the other hand, remained where he was, his eyes calm, but his hands clenched the edge of his shirt. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight touched the edges of the curtains, Dr. Patel returned. He knew without looking at the monitor. He walked in, saw the three people huddled together silently around the bed. No loud crying, no panic. Just a silence that was overwhelming, a silence not of loss, but of relief. Dr. Patel bowed his head, and for the first time since he had treated Grace, he did not sign the death certificate. He sat down, adjusting the sheet covering the patient. "Death sometimes," he said softly, "does not end things, but returns them to time." Eli pulled a piece of paper from his pocket and placed it in his grandmother's hand. No one knew what was written on it. Maybe it was an equation. Maybe it was a story. Maybe it was just 2 words. Understood. And then, like a star completing its orbit after millions of years of flying silently in the dark, Grace passed away. Not in pain, but in love that was still intact, even though it had been lost. On the morning of the 4th day, after a small memorial service in the backyard, while the dew was still on the camellias, Zoe was the first to mention her return. Not with words of farewell, but with a very concrete action. She handed Mia a small bag. Inside was a prepared file, including the death certificate, a few photocopies of the medical records, and a handwritten letter in purple ink, folded into 3. "This is from Mom," Zoe said, not trying to emphasize anything. "I'll still call often, and Eli will always have a place in this family's hearts." No one said anything more. This parting, strangely enough, no longer carried the gloomy mist of resentment, nor was it burdened by things not yet forgiven. It was like putting away an old book. Not because it had been forgotten, but because it had been memorized. That afternoon at San Francisco International Airport, mother and son stood at the boarding gate. Eli had little more than 3 books in his backpack, and the small courthouse badge that Mark Reed had quietly pinned to his pocket on the memorial service. A reminder, or an invitation. On the flight back to Chicago, the sky was clear. The golden sunlight pouring through the windows, reflecting softly on Mia's eyes. In the rare quiet moments when the passengers had drifted off to sleep or their personal entertainment screens, Mia turned to her son. Her voice soft enough not to disturb anyone, but clear enough that he couldn't avoid her. "Eli," she asked, "I still don't understand. Why did you decide to stand up? On the plane the other day. It wasn't like what I taught you, not to cause trouble." Eli didn't answer right away. He took a sip of water, then opened his bag and pulled out a folded piece of paper, a printed copy of Section 382 of the Air Carrier Access Act. He didn't hand it to his mother, just placed it gently on the kitchen table in front of him, like a lawyer placing evidence on a negotiating table. "Grace used to say," he replied, "that love is not just about bearing, but but also about knowing boundaries. She taught me that justice is not always loud, but when it is silent for too long, some people think it doesn't exist. Mia nodded slightly, her gaze stopping on a young flight attendant who was checking seats. She said nothing more. But deep down, she understood. She understood that years of raising a child in silence, with so many hesitations and struggles, had finally given birth to a child who thought and dared to stand up, not for arguments, but for the right reasons. At the same time, from the back row, a familiar voice rang out. If you've ever thought about going to Harvard Kennedy or Yale Law, email me. It was Mark Reed, a lawyer and passenger from the previous trip, who had stood up to support Eli. He handed him a business card, smiling and tilting his head as if he were talking to a colleague rather than an 11-year-old. Eli took it, expressionless, but his eyes lit up for a second, then returned to normal. As the plane began to descend, and the flight attendants called out to passengers to fasten their seatbelts, Mia turned to look at her son. On the dining table in front of Eli was a court badge, Mark Reed's business card, and an old copy of the law. There were no pictures, no material gifts from Grace were brought with them. But Mia knew her true legacy to her grandson was not in the suitcase, nor in the letters. It was in Eli's understanding of who he was, what he needed, and how he would live so that what was right would always have a chance to be heard, even in places where no one seemed to be listening. She took her son's hand, squeezing it gently. This time, not to lead him, but to confirm that from now on he would be the one to pave the way. Not with strength, but with wisdom, kindness, and the silent legacy of a grandmother who had loved, taught, and finally understood. The pain of losing a mother, even though wrapped up in rituals and farewells, does not disappear. It is still there, smoldering like an old wound every time a memory, a recollection is touched. But the miracle is, in the void that has just been lost, new things have been quietly born. A connection was mended, an inner journey closed, and another door opened. Unspoken words were rewritten in action. And most of all, a new generation rose up, with wisdom, with compassion, and with a calmness rarely seen at the age of 11. Eli, the child who once hid behind formulas and rules, has learned to step out, not just to understand the world, but to heal it. Without raising a banner, he makes people listen simply by standing up at the right time and in the right way. For Mia, it was the most profound reward that life, despite all its unfairness, had given her. An extraordinary son, not because he was special, but because he had the courage to remain gentle in a competitive world. A child who saw the truth with the sharp eyes of reason, but understood love with the delicacy of a heart that had witnessed loss. And though the journey ahead is still uncertain, with unforeseen challenges, with questions that life has no answers to, they will continue together. Not in fear, but in faith, that when knowledge is their compass, courage is their motivation, and love is their anchor, no night is too long. Thank you for joining us in this story. If it resonates with you, somewhere in a glance, a word, or a moment of silence, please share your thoughts below. Each message from you helps us bring more honest and moving stories to more people. See you on the next journey.